Hello, and welcome to another 30 Minutes with Servoy Developer Series. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Steve Portnoy. I'm with Servoy, and with me as always is Sean. Party on, Sean.
Party on,
And
Steve.
this morning we're going to be discussing UX patterns, lookup form. But before we get into this, I did want to say something, which is thank you to everybody who attended our 8.2 launch series. We had a great turnout for that, and a lot of great response during and after. And if you missed any of them, as always, you can find recordings of each of the webinars on the Servoy forum under the announcements thread. In addition to recordings of those webinars, there's also links to the wiki documentation and the sample solutions and anything you might need to review and or get caught up on those. So again, thank you very much to everybody who attended those, and thank you to those who are attending today's. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Sean.
Thank you,
Oh, I'm
Steve.
sorry. Before I go, as always, if you have questions, there is a questions panel in the webinar. Go ahead and type your questions, and either during or at the end, we will do our best to get those answered.
All right, is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yeah, and to the point about the 8.2 stuff, if you haven't seen it, catch up now because 8.2.1 is coming out, and there's new stuff in extensions. So it's it never ends. Today should be pretty, I think, concise and fun. We're going to take a look at really just a UX pattern that I think I see in loads of business applications. And I was working with a couple customers that needed the same pattern, and I thought, well, let's make an example of it, and it sort of turned into a little module. And I thought, oh, this is great for the tech webinar series. So this should be pretty short, concise, fun. It's really a mashup of Servoy tricks too. So for me, doing this was kind of an affirmation that Servoy really is still a productive platform to make the UX that you want, because I got to just sort of cobble together a bunch of tricks and extensions and get this UX pattern. So we're just going to do a quick demo of what it is, and then we'll sort of step through the code and then just do a quick overview of what we have just seen. So I'm switching over to the HTML5 client, and just a quick overview of what this UX pattern is. Let's say you want to select, I don't know, a product, and typically you might put a drop down like combo box or a value list on a form, but what I'm hearing is from time to time is, hey, we want to be able to show multiple columns, say in the drop down, rather than it just be the type ahead and you see the one value showing up, or the concatenated two values from a value list. So I hear sometimes we want to be able to see multiple columns, perhaps related data from other tables. Also, the search portion, the type ahead works mostly on typing, and you get sort of the starts with thing, but maybe you need a bit more complexity in the search, like you want to be able to put in several words, like an internet search, and it'd be tokenized, and then you really see the matching results. So let's take a look. So I'm trying to pick a product. I click in here to this component, choose a product, and you see that here, instead of getting a regular type ahead, I get a grid presentation, and I have more than just one column. I have the product name, but then I also relate over to one table the category to show the category, and then also over to the supplier of that product. So if I want to search on, say, the company name who supplies the product. So now I'm going to type a few keystrokes, and you'll see as I type, let's do beverages, and then I'll do a space, and then so the search gets tokenized by words, and then I'm going to type in BIG, and you can see that I get beverages, and I also get Bigfoot Breweries from the category and the supplier. And then I'm going to hit my arrow key down and select the logger and hit enter, and you can see that's selected. So you could do, you can just type, and you never have to leave the keyboard. You can arrow down. I could also oops, do seafood. I could also use the mouse and scroll through, and this uses the grid component, so it's got really fast scrolling, and I can use the mouse to select as well. So that's really it for the UX pattern. Let's go ahead and look at how it was done. And the thing that's interesting about this is it's not really a new component to do this. It's more of, like I said, a mashup of existing tricks and extensions. So I'm going to go under the hood to Servoy Developer and have a look at this form, test lookup. And so here you can see on this form I have a component on action. It's just a field, and on action I have this select product method, and I made a little API called SVY lookup. So I'm creating this lookup object, and I'm adding the fields to it. So the first thing I do is create the lookup object, and I pass in the data source. In this case, we want to look at the products table, and then I start adding the fields. First, I want to see the category that's related. I'm also setting the title text, so that's what goes on the column, and then I do the product name and the supplier. So you can see that this is an API that will generate code complete. So as I add the field and the data provider, then I can do things like set the title text or the value list, indicate whether or not it's searchable. So I could, let's say, have something on there which is in the display, but I don't necessarily want to search on it as well. By default, everything that you put on there is searchable. So what you see is what you can search on. Okay, so then once I've sort of created this lookup object, which is sort of an abstraction of, what I want it to, what I want to show, what the data source is and what the fields are, then I just want to show it. So I want to show it relative to a component. So it drops down right below that search box. So that element is called product ID. And then in this case, I'm seeding it with an initial value. So if I have something already selected, then you can see it goes and it selects that in the list there. So I'm able to seed it with that initial value. If I didn't put anything there, then it would just go to the full list, and it would be a blank search criteria. So then finally, I call this lookup object show popup, and if we look at code complete here, you see that it's an overloaded method. So at a minimum, what I need is the callback, the function that will be called when the popup is when a value inside the popup is selected, and then the target, the component that you want to show the popup on. In addition to that, you can do width, height, and initial value. I've chosen to do null for the width and height. The width will then be taken to match the component that you're showing it on, so it lines up under there, but you could actually pass in an arbitrary width and an arbitrary height. The height is also like an arbitrary default that is used, but you could override that. So if I wanted to, for example, make this 1,000 pixels wide and 600 pixels tall, and then I come back here, you can see that now the lookup is much bigger. So it's immediately can be editable. So again, I show the pop-up. I pass in the onSelect function, which receives the callback after a value is selected. So you can see that here it passes in the pop-up in the generic sense always passes a JS record object back. However, I'm in the type tag here, or in the param tag here, I'm casting it as a products record because I know that that's what the data source is that I used. Therefore, I get code complete on product ID, and I'm just setting that back to that form variable, that data provider to which that initial field is bound. So that's pretty much it at a high level. If we jump into this SVY lookup scope, and I look at the outline here, you can see that there's really two classes, lookup and lookup field. And we called create lookup, and then you can see in the outline the methods on the lookup itself, and then each field in the lookup. This is just sort of an abstraction of what you want. At the end, you call show popup, and it's using a default implementation. And this is where we get into some form inheritance. We have a form called abstract lookup, which is nothing, but it has some of the blueprint for showing the lookup. And then we have the SVY lookup table, which is one level below that. And this is essentially the form that's being shown. Now, the reason I'm showing this is it's nice if you just want to take the little module and use it as is, but if you wanted to extend the form and customize it in a way that you like, maybe you add some buttons to it for closing it or something like that. But we'll come back to the form inheritance stuff. If we look at the show popup method, I just want to point out, because I thought this was a really good example of, I put this together inside of a day, but now it's a reusable kind of pattern. I want to show sort of the ingredients, so it's a bit of a learning exercise in what went into it. So one of the first things is to show a form in a pop-up. When we get the pop-up here, you'll notice that as it pops up, if I click away in the body of the form, it's dismissed. So it's not really a dialogue or a modal dialogue. It's not as heavy, and it's got really that UX that's more common to web applications where you don't have multi-windows and dialogues. You have things popping up and dismissing easily. So the main ingredient for that part of the pattern is the show form pop-up method of the window plugin. So this is already something that ships by default with Servoy and is available in all the client offerings, so the Smart Client and the HTML5 client, etc. And really, what this takes is the form that you want to show. The first thing is the component you want to show it relative to, then the form that you want to show, and it does have the ability to bind to a scope and a variable. In this case, I'm not using that. That's why I've put foobar in there and then this. So I could show a form pop-up, and then when you close the form pop-up, you can just return a value, and it will automatically assign it to that. I find that that's a little bit inflexible. So what I do is I do a callback. So you can see that what I've done here is for the first argument of the show pop-up method in the base form, it takes a callback, and I sort of store that in this variable called selection handler. And when we dismiss the pop-up, or when we select in the pop-up, we just proactively call the callback and pass the value back. Because in this case, I want to do a whole record. I don't know, maybe the caller wants to take the record and do something with it. In this use case, we are writing it back to a data provider, but I feel that's a little bit limited, which is why I just made the callback instead. So then it's the same options as before, the width and the height, that you can also set. So again, it's on the window plugin, show form pop-up, and it's just standard functionality you get with nearly every version of Servoy. The next thing you might have noticed is that this is running every keystroke. So as I type, every keystroke is sending. Moreover, as I hit I'm going to hit my down arrow key, you can see that I now have focus on the table, and I'm able to arrow through those. And when I hit my enter key, I'm able to select a value. Also, if I'm showing this and I hit the escape key, I'm able to dismiss it. So there's a little bit of keyboard interaction going on there, and I'm able to get that mouseless kind of feel on this pattern, and I want to show you the ingredients for that. So the next thing I want to look at is the key listener, the use of the key listener extension. So I think that's over here. So the moment that we focus on the field, I'm adding a listener. Basically what I'm doing is I'm setting a little flag if I've added it yet or not, because it sort of gets removed automatically every time the form shows. So I just want to add it once. So I use this little key listener ready flag, which is just a form variable. But the real line here that you want to pay attention to is this. We have a whole other webinar about this particular extension, but this is, if you've missed that, just a 10-second recap. This is what we call an NG service, which allows you to invoke some behavior in the browser, and it's exposed as a plugin. So the key listener service allows you to attach a callback function to receive events every time a key is pressed on a target component. Okay, so I'm adding the key listener to the search box on that lookup form that's being shown in the pop-up, and I'm using this on-key event or handler to handle the event. So if we look at that, you can see this passing in a number of arguments, and I want to point out to those of you who are already familiar with the key listener, we just added these additional arguments, and this is available in the latest release on the key listener NG service. So initially it was just sending back the value of the component. So as you type, it would send back the full string that's in the component as you're typing. But in this case, I wanted to be able to handle the down arrows. So I took the key event and I passed back more information, including the key code and the alt key. So if there was some modifier attached to that as well, like a shift or control or something. So the key code 40 is the arrow down key, so I'm just handling that. It could be, that's sort of arbitrary, but I think that's common when you're doing that lookup sort of pattern. So if I arrow down, then I'm handling that, and I'm just requesting focus into the table, and then I'm done. Otherwise, I want to run my search on the full value that's been typed. So so that's how we were able to do the searching as we type. Now, for the search itself, we use another extension, but before we get to that, I want to go to two other things that you may have noticed. One is that when I hit enter, I'm selecting the value, and the other one is when I hit escape, I'm dismissing the pop-up. And I did that a little bit differently. You can see that when the form is shown, I'm also creating keyboard shortcuts. And this is, again, on the window plugin, the same plugin that shows the pop-up. So this is standard functionality. You don't have to include any extra libraries to get this. And this works in the browser as well. So you're able to attach a listener or a callback function to handle when a keyboard shortcut is typed. So in this case, I'm binding to the enter key and the escape key. And you'll notice that I can attach a function. So I have on enter and dismiss. And as well as I'm passing in controller get name, which is the name of the form. So the third argument in that call is the context, so that you can leave that null and you have sort of a global keyboard shortcut that is available at any point in your application. But here it's just really specific to this form. So when this form's showing, then I want to handle this. When this form is gone, then we don't want to handle this anymore. And so that gives me that level of granularity. If we look quickly at the on enter, this is where I did a bit of testing here. I can remove that. But this is where I call that on select, which then calls my select handler. So you remember I was storing that function and we pass this back. So anyway, I just wanted to point out that that happens when we do the on enter. Same with the, I lost my place here. Oh, I'm in the base form, that's why. Same with the escape key. In this case, I'm calling the dismiss function, and oops, that is also in the base form. And that just closes the form pop-up. So that's the same as when you click out. So I just wanted to point out window plugin, add keyboard shortcuts, gave me that additional functionality once the pop-up has been shown. Let's get back to the search. So remembering that as I'm typing keys, I'm calling that search method and passing in a string of what the user has just typed. in the base form, I have this method search, and you'll notice that there's not a lot of code. So if you haven't learned already, there's a module to help with that. It's called SVY Search. It's one of the most popular extensions that we have out published on GitHub and available through the Web Package Manager. And really what this does is it's saying, first of all, if there's no value, we want to load all records. Otherwise, it's using this API called SVY Search. We create this simple search object. We set the value that was just typed. I give it the ability to just search on all text. The default is no, but all text columns can be just made searchable with one line. But in this case, I think it's more intuitive that we're only searching on things that we can see. Therefore, if you type something and then you get a match and you don't see it, it's a bit unclear. So the default is no. And then I'm iterating over that. I have that lookup object that I initially have shown, and I'm iterating over it, and I'm calling this add search provider. And really, when you call this, you can pass in a data provider, and then you can do a whole bunch of other stuff. You can set an alias, you can set case sensitivity, etc. So that in and of itself is a whole other library, and it's just for text-based kind of semantics when searching. So it's low code, no SQL kind of thing. So just wanted to point that out. That's how we're doing the search, and that's also in another webinar, and there's lots of other resources about that. Okay, so let me just jump back to the presentation here and just kind of show you what went into this. If we're going pretty fast and there was a lot of different things I showed you, if you get none of it or very little of it, that's okay, because we're going to publish this as a standalone module, which is something that you could just download and use. You can just call the, create lookup and then show pop-up, and that's it, and just use the basic implementation. But I just thought that since this is the tech webinar series, it's a good excuse to kind of show the ingredients that went into that, because when you want to make your own user experience pattern, there's a lot of different tools at your disposal, but maybe it's not intuitive or immediately understandable how that you would integrate those together to produce the end result. So this is the list of the ingredients that went into the UX pattern. And if we look at these individually, just to recap, again, when we showed the form in that dismissible pop-up, we used the window plugin calling show form pop-up. And there we're showing it relative to the component that was clicked. You have the option to set a data provider automatically. In my case, I used the callback because I think that's a bit more flexible. So I passed in a function, I stored it, and then when they click or when they hit enter, we're calling that function and passing the record back into it. Another thing was that I was searching on every keystroke, and so for this I used the key listener, which is an NG service that's available through the Web Package Manager, and it gives you the functionality to handle keystrokes on any component. And now it's just been updated to receive non-text key codes and modifiers. So that's how I was able to handle the down arrow to get back down into the table component. When we were doing the search, we used another extension here, also available through the Web Package Manager, the SVY Search module. And this, as I said before, is really one of the most popular and most used extensions that we have, because it's very generic and it's really low code. You don't have to do any SQL stuff, and it has a pretty robust API, and it has a user interface that's very intuitive, because it just takes simple text and it tokenizes the input based on words, separated by space, and it allows the developer to just say, I want this data provider, that data provider, that data provider, and then that's it. They're done. We also use the keyboard shortcuts, which is, again, part of the window plugin. So that's how we were able to handle the enter key and the escape key to dismiss, to select or dismiss in the pop-up. A couple of useful links here that I'll leave up as we take any questions. We're going to post this as a little helper module on a repository called SVY Lookup. I'm going to do that later today after the webinar. Already you can go get the latest version of SVY Search or SVY Key Listener. Those are available through the Web Package Manager. As always, you can watch recordings of this and others on the Tech Webinar Series homepage, and please post your feedback and look for announcements on, we have a dedicated forum thread on forum.servoy.com under the announcements category, and that's where we post also links to every webinar recording and slides and example solutions. Steve, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. First of all, great stuff. So a couple of questions from Quail, and the first one actually ties into a question that I have. Actually, her second question. She says, it works well in the web client. Does it also work in the smart client? You sort of answered that with the show form pop-up, that the show form pop-up does work in all clients. What about the key listener? Does that only work in the NG client?
So yeah, so the complete example that I showed here only works in the NG client. However, you could get the same UX in the smart client with a bit of a different mix of ingredients. So the key listener is NG client only, but there's a key listener plugin for the smart client. It's just because the smart client is Java Swing, it needs a bit of a different way of adding that. So you can get that. Also, the grid component was used, the NG client grid component was used in the base form, but you could make your own base form, which extends the abstract lookup base form and has the like a table view form, which is also compatible for the smart client. So Quail, no and yes, you can't. What I showed would not work, but could be easily modified or adapted to run in the smart client.
Great. Her other question was, does this have the same record number limitations that a dropdown has, which is currently, she believes, 500 records?
Okay, yeah, good question. So no, not at all. The number of results is actually found set based. So it's more like when you work with a form, initially it's limited to 200. But if I had more than 200 results, as you saw as I was arrowing through the grid, it would do the infinite scrolling thing or the pagination thing, depending on how you have it set up.
Got it.
So it's not limited.
A couple of other questions from Steve. Where can we find a table of key codes and alt key codes?
Yeah, I had the same question myself when I was starting this. I just did an internet search. I think that I could have. I did 40. I just was being lazy, and if I when I publish this, I'm going to replace that with a constant. I believe in Java there's an enum, so you could just reference the enum directly to get the key code, but I'm not exactly sure where that is. But it's probably all in the Java documentation. And when I publish this, I'll replace the 40 with a constant, I think.
Ram has posted that you can find them at ASCIItable.com, which I have not verified, but I'm going to go ahead and post that URL in the chat window to everybody.
Okay.
So that's the answer to one of his questions. The other question Steve had was, can it do multi-select?
Yeah, so it could. I wanted to get the multi-select working for this example, but I ran out of time, so I plan to add it because, yeah, obviously you might want to show the pop-up and then click a few records and then dismiss it and get those records back. So it could be easily adapted to the multi-select, and that's sort of in the plans for the next iteration of this feature. How you do that in the UI, I think initially would just be enabling multi-select on the found set, and then the component can do the shift click and everything. But of course, you might have a different implementation in mind.
All right.
One other trick that I forgot to mention that went into this, Steve, also is the solution model. The fact that we have a base form which has no data source, but when we say, okay, I create a lookup object, now I want to show it, what we're really doing is cloning that form and then setting the data source and then adding columns to it, to the table there. So I did want to mention all the tricks that went involved, and it just occurred to me that I left out the solution model. So that's one other area that you would need if you were to do something like this from scratch.